So good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Gillikin. I'm the co-chair of Livable Cville. Livable Cville is an all-volunteer group whose vision is to create a livable, thriving Charlottesville for everyone. We advocate for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods that are welcoming to all. And one of our values as a group is that housing is a human right, and it's a clear violation of that basic right when someone in our community experiences homelessness. And homelessness is a worsening issue in our area. According to the Blue Ridge Area Coalition for the Homeless, the point in time count for our area jumped by 50% to 266 people in 2022. And more than 440 people experiencing homelessness accessed the Haven's day shelter services more than 19,000 times in 2022. Charlottesville is in the midst of a housing crisis. I think these numbers highlight that. And I think that thinking well on the topic of homelessness will help us think well about how to address our bigger housing issues. Unfortunately, we often don't think well about this issue. So that's why we had an event in December, which you can get the recording of on our YouTube channel, and why we're having this event today. We were very locally focused in December with our speakers. Today, we've got a national speaker, researcher, Dr. Gregg Colburn from the University of Washington, but we're going to bring it back to the local focus after he talks with Anna Mendez from the Haven hopping on. So quick introductions. Gregg Colburn's an assistant professor of real estate at University of Washington's College of Built Environments. He has a PhD from University of Minnesota, a master's in social work from the University of Minnesota, and an MBA from Northwestern University. He entered academia after spending the first 17 years of his professional life in the private sector. He teaches course in housing, economics, finance to both undergrad and graduate students. He maintains an active research agenda focused on housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homeless. He's also engaged in a wide range of community efforts to address the acute housing crisis in the Puget Sound region. I was trying to find a Charlottesville connection with Gregg. I did a deep dive, and he went to Albion College in Michigan. Fellow alumni there is Fritz Shermer, the former defensive coordinator of the Packers team that won the 1996 Super Bowl. They beat the Patriots. That Patriots team featured Chris Slade, who's a UVA graduate and current UVA defensive end coach. So Gregg's practically a loco based on
That's
that
right. That's
Kevin
right.
Bacon style. So significantly, Gregg wrote this book, or co-wrote this book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, which is an excellent book that I highly recommend. And Livable Cville has actually handed this book out to City Council, the City Manager, the City Planning Commission, the County Board of Supervisors, and the County Planning Commission. Actually, we've got some copies going to the Nelson County Board of Supervisors, as well as some other local leaders. We think this book is really important for our area to help think about housing. Also, real quick introduction for Anna Mendez. She's the executive director of the Haven, role she's had since November. She's been there about 100 days now. She's committed to the principles of the housing first model. She knows that all people can thrive in housing and that housing is the answer to homelessness. Prior to her time at the Haven, Anna was the executive director of Central Virginia's affiliate of Mental Health America for 6 years. She recently completed a joint fellowship at UVA's Equity Center and School of Law, where her research and teaching centered on decriminalizing the experience of mental illness. She frequently serves as a consultant to state agencies and the General Assembly on issues related to improving Virginia's mental health service system and the intersection of housing and mental illness. So Dr. Colburn is going to start in just a second. The format will be he's going to present for a little bit, and then we're going to have a Q&A time with him and with Anna. You can submit questions in the chat. The way our chat is set up is that you can chat with me. You cannot chat with each other. There's not going to be chat chaos, but we would love you to, just as questions pop up, throw them our way, and then we will have a Q&A time after Gregg's talk. So Gregg, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate the invitation, and good evening to all of you in Charlottesville from chilly Seattle. I actually worked in New York out of undergrad and had a bunch of UVA buddies, both as colleagues and friends. And so I've been to Charlottesville, so there is a connection there. And one of my good friends in New York was from Crawfordsville, Indiana, and his nickname was Cville. And so it's so funny to see this in your title, because I've only ever used Cville as a nickname for my friend. So anyway, that's the extent of my Charlottesville connections, in addition to the Shermer family, who was football royalty at my undergrad school. Okay, here we are. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes here and give you an overview of the book that my colleague Clayton Aldrin and I wrote, called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. It actually came out about a year ago, mid-March of 2022. The University of California Press was our publisher on this project. That's the book. And just a brief couple words on motivation here. I moved to Seattle in 2017, and because I study housing, quickly got involved in a lot of community conversations around the housing and homelessness crisis. If you haven't been to Seattle recently, it has gotten very, very, very bad. It has materially deteriorated in the 6 years that I've been in Seattle. And I've had people, come and visit and said, I just can't believe what's happening in the city. And so it really is, it's a tragedy. And so there's no shortage of attention on the issue. It's front page news every day in the city. It's the biggest issue in our elections. But I observed as I sat in these meetings that I didn't really think that we as a community had really understood what the root cause or driver of this problem was. And as a result, our policy responses were a little scattershot. One day we're focusing on this, one day we're focusing on that, and there's really not a concerted focus on what I really believe to be the fundamental driver of this crisis, which is a lack of access to affordable housing. And so therefore, what I wanted to do was really take what we knew from the academic literature about the relationship between housing market conditions and homelessness and translate that into a book that was accessible for a broader population of readers, and use some of our own original research and data to hopefully make the argument that a lot of these competing explanations of homelessness, while interesting and relevant, don't explain the real problem that we have in our coastal cities right now. And I think the relevance to a community like Charlottesville is there are a lot of dynamic growing cities, in the middle of the country, away from the coast, that are starting to experience housing pressures that the big six cities are. And when I say the big six, I'm referring to Boston, New York, Washington, DC, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. That's the big six for a housing crisis in the United States. And that's where disproportionate numbers of people experiencing homelessness reside. But other communities, smaller communities, are not immune. And we're starting to see this. I think Austin, Texas is a prime example. That's a city that has kind of kept up with the demands. They are not keeping up anymore, and they are starting to see housing and homelessness problems that look a lot more like Los Angeles than they look like a Texas city. I've been to Boise, Idaho, similar story. I'm going to Kentucky. I'm going to Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm here speaking to you. And so there are a lot of communities around the nation, north, south, east, and west, that are beginning to realize that that these housing pressures are going to create challenges for their community at an individual and community level. And so that's why we wanted to write the book. So when we start to talk about causation, if you go and get a PhD, or if you have if you make the poor choice to do so, you'll spend a lot of time thinking about causation in the social sciences, and that's what I do when I was getting my PhD. Now, causation can be somewhat easier in the physical sciences, right? If you ask what causes a pencil to fall to the ground, we would say gravity and move on, right? It's not a terribly contested topic. If we then move and say, well, what causes someone to be admitted to Harvard? That's a little more complicated. Why is it more complicated? Because people are complicated. And human and social interaction is complicated. A lot of things combine to produce a specific outcome, right? Someone might get into Harvard because he or she's really smart. Someone might get in because they were a really good hockey player. Someone might get in because their grandparents gave $100 million to Harvard, right? Or some combination thereof. So a lot of causation in the social world is what we'd call complex causation, meaning a lot of factors come together to produce an outcome. When we ask the question, what causes homelessness? This is a prime example of complex causality. I've never experienced homelessness. I have never experienced housing precarity, but I've talked to a lot of people who have, either formally or at the time that I've spoken to them. And I can tell you each story is unique. I'm not going to tell you there's one pathway into homelessness. I would be completely disingenuous, and it'd be inappropriate for me to do so. So what we're trying to in this book is not to explain all the pathways into homelessness. What we're trying to understand is what is the context that produces disproportionate rates of homelessness. That's the purpose of the book. So one of the challenges that we have when we talk about causation and homelessness is that we ask different questions. And so one of the questions we actually is part of the survey, the annual census of homelessness that happens every January around the country. I'm sure this happened for your jurisdiction here in the last week of January of 2023. In addition to counting and creating an estimate of the homeless population, we actually conduct a survey and we ask people questions about their experiences with housing and homelessness. And so these are responses to a question that was posed in the Seattle-King County point in time survey in 2019, which was basically, why are you homeless? Right? And we get all these responses from people. I've lost my job. I drink too much. I got divorced. My intimate partner, beat me up. I couldn't pay my rent. I got in an argument with my roommate. And so when the Seattle Times gets a hold of these, they publish an article and they say, here are the causes of homelessness. And I kind of scratch my head and say, ugh. It's not that I don't honor these explanations. These explanations are absolutely truthful and they explain the situation in which people are. But I don't believe that divorce is a cause of homelessness, a root cause of homelessness, right? I joke that we could have a national campaign to end divorce, and that might be positive. I'm not in favor of divorce, but if you think that's going to end homelessness, we're fooling ourselves, right? So what we try to do in the book is to draw a distinction between root causes and precipitating events. Getting in an argument with your roommate and then ending up homeless is what I would call a precipitating event. It doesn't mean that that argument isn't important, and it doesn't mean that it had a profound impact on that person. It absolutely did, but it's not the root cause, right? If all arguments with friends and family lead to homelessness, not a person on this call wouldn't be at risk of homelessness, right? That's just living life. Okay, so what we want to do is understand what are precipitating events and what are the root causes. And therefore, if we would really want to attack this problem, focusing on these root causes is really important. So an analogy or metaphor that we use in the book to explain the difference between a root cause and a precipitating event is this, the game of musical chairs. So imagine 10 friends get together, play the game of musical chairs. The leader starts the music. They start walking around in a circle. The leader pulls one chair out. We now have 10 people and 9 chairs. And when the music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair. And in this case, Mike was actually on crutches after spraining his ankle, and he lost the game, not surprisingly. And so if ESPN were there covering the sporting event and they asked him afterwards, Mike, why'd you lose the game? He would say, well, I had a bad ankle, right? And everyone would say, well, of course, that's why Mike lost the game. But if we really think more critically about this, the reason why Mike lost the game was because we didn't have enough chairs. If we'd had 10 chairs, he would have found one. It might have taken longer, right? And so the point is that when there's scarcity, the scarcity then highlights vulnerability. Okay, and this is what's happening in our coastal cities right now. When you don't have enough housing, people who are vulnerable for one reason or another, who have risk factors for homelessness, are the ones who are identified as most likely to experience homelessness. And when we see that person on the street, we might ask them, why are you homeless? And they say, oh, I have a bad ankle. I'm mentally ill. I drink too much. And what we need to do is take a step back and think critically about what is it that produced this bout of homelessness, just like with Mike and his bad ankle. And so it's not to suggest that the sprained ankle or the addiction or the behavioral health crisis isn't important. It absolutely is. But the structural deficit of housing or chairs in this analogy really explains why someone is going to end up homeless. And when you don't have enough housing, by definition, the game is rigged to make sure that someone loses, right? And the people in Seattle who are going to lose are not Amazon tech employees. It's people who are poor. It's people who have been subject to racial discrimination. It's people who have health problems, et cetera. So while tragic, this outcome shouldn't surprise anyone. So we know that drug use, mental illness, poverty, some of these individual risk factors certainly are causes of homelessness at the individual level. If I'm poor, if I'm addicted, if I'm mentally ill, I'm far more likely to experience homelessness. No doubt about it. Okay? But the point of this book is to take our attention away from that point, because we also know that those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts, like Seattle, and not others. People always come back to me and say, well, Greg, I saw all these drug users on the street in Seattle. And I said, yes, you're right. And they said, this is obviously a drug problem. I said, well, if you think it's a drug problem, why doesn't West Virginia have a huge homelessness problem? The home of the opioid epidemic in the United States. If that really is the core driver here, we should have a massive homeless population in West Virginia. And if you look at the numbers, we don't. And that's not to minimize the opioid epidemic. Obviously, we need to address that. But if you fundamentally believe that drug use is the core driver of this, you would need to explain why there are other places with just as much, if not more, drug use than Seattle that have far lower rates of homelessness, right? So the context in which that drug use, addiction, the mental illness happen, that's what the most important thing. So the question that we pose in the book and that we seek to answer is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? So for example, why does Seattle have 4 to 5 times the per capita rates of homelessness of Chicago? Two, seemingly vibrant, dynamic cities. And is it that we have lots more homelessness because we have more people with these individual vulnerabilities? That's a fair question. If poverty, drug use, and mental illness cause homelessness, presumably the disproportionate presence of people with those conditions would produce higher rates of homelessness. Totally logical explanation. Turns out it's not true. So this is a book about cities, not about people. And that doesn't mean that person-focused research on homelessness isn't important. It absolutely is. This is just a different exercise. We're focused on cities. What is it about certain jurisdictions that produce disproportionate rates of homelessness? The thesis of our book is that tight housing markets accentuate these vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities end up serving as a sorting mechanism and identify the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. That's the gist of the argument we're making. So the sample in our book is about the 35 largest metro areas in the United States. And for those of you who are familiar with counting homelessness, we have a jurisdictional unit called a continuum of care. And basically every area of the country is covered by a COC. Some of those cover large expanses of land. Some of them cover a county around a major metropolitan area, and some focus on just a city. And so what's important is that city-based COCs tend to have the highest per capita rates of homelessness because it's only the city. There are no suburban locations included in that number. And so when you compare jurisdiction to jurisdiction, you need to compare like COCs to like COCs. So I can't compare King County, Washington, which is a county-based COC, to New York City, which is a city COC, because county-based COCs have lower per capita rates of homelessness because you're including suburban locations that all else equal generally have lower rates of homelessness. Okay, so on this graph, on this chart, I should say, what you'll see is in that the top half, we've got the city COCs in our sample. And what you'll see is it ranges from about 2 on the low end in Indianapolis to about 10 per capita in New York City. It's about a 5-to-1 relationship. When you move to counties, the numbers are lower because of the suburban phenomenon, but what's really interesting is the same 5-to-1 relationship exists. LA County, Santa Clara, King County, and Multnomah are about 5 per capita versus 1 in Hillsborough, which is Tampa, Florida. So the point here is that we've got huge variation. It's 5-to-1 variation, whether you're looking at cities or counties. And so that's what we want to explain. And what I stress for people is that this is massive variation. We're not talking about a 20 or 30% difference. This is 5 times. Huge, huge variation. And so we can learn something, I think, if we can explain why this variation exists. So what we do in the book is we have 3 chapters we basically take a range of explanations for homelessness and test whether they explain this regional variation. And we basically just tick through them one at a time. And I won't do all of them here in this presentation because of time constraints, but I'll at least give you a number of them to give you kind of the gist of the logic of our argument. So we start with some individual explanations, and the most obvious being poverty. If you are experiencing poverty, you're far more likely to experience homelessness, as we've discussed. And so you're going to see a range of these graphs here. And so just to orient you, for those of you who don't look at statistical graphs very often or on a daily basis, what we're doing here, the bottom axis or the x-axis is kind of the explanatory variable here. In this case, the rate of poverty. It would be the percentage of people in your community who are below the federal poverty line. The y-axis or the vertical axis is the rate of homelessness. So the higher the number, the higher the per capita rate of homelessness. And each dot represents one of these cities or counties in one of the years between 2007 and 2019. So what's important here is that we see R squared as a statistical measure of variation explained. And so the higher that number gets, or the closer the R squared gets to 1, the more explanatory power that you have. As that gets to 0, there's basically no relationship. It's just random dots on a board. And so here we actually have a modest statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but what's interesting is it's in the opposite direction of what you would expect. Where poverty is higher, rates of homelessness tend to be lower, which is a complete head scratcher because we know poverty causes homelessness. So what the heck is going on here? So think of communities like St. Louis and Detroit and Cleveland, which are some of the most impoverished communities in the country, but they have far lower rates of homelessness than Seattle and San Francisco, which are among the most affluent places in the nation. Okay, so homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not amidst poverty. Okay, so we don't have a problem in Seattle because we have lots and lots of poor people walking around. In fact, we have far fewer poor people on a relative basis than many other cities in the nation. Yet we've got a huge homelessness problem. Okay, so we can't blame lots of poor people being in our community for the regional variation. There's no doubt that serious mental illness is a driver of homelessness. This data comes at the state level because the data on drug and alcohol use and mental illness is better at the state level, but it's the same logic. This is every state in the nation between 2007 and 2019 comparing their rates of serious mental illness to rates of homelessness. The R squared here is 0.05, which just basically means there's no relationship here. There are places with more mental illness, there are places with less mental illness, and it bears zero relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay, so we don't have a problem in Washington because we have more people with mental illness. Do we have some people experiencing mental illness? Of course we do. Of course we do. But it's not disproportionate presence of those people that explains our problem. Now, is the consequence of serious mental illness different in Seattle than it is in Detroit? Absolutely. Right? Because the cost of living here is so extreme, and if you have any vulnerability, it is very hard to get housing. But the mere presence of more people with mental illness doesn't explain homelessness. This is substance use disorders, same thing, R squared is 0.06, basically no relationship. There's not a story here. There's more substance use in some states than others, bears no relationship to rates of homelessness. Another important discussion when we get to homelessness is race. Black, brown, indigenous people in households are vastly disproportionately represented in the homeless population, roughly 3 to 4 times. And that's true in Seattle, true in Chicago. But what's interesting is that the mere presence of people in households of color does not produce disproportionately high rates of homelessness. So race doesn't cause homelessness. Chicago has a far larger, far higher Black population than does Seattle, but it has lower rates of homelessness. Okay, so race doesn't cause homelessness or doesn't produce regional variation, but racism does help identify who's most likely to experience homelessness within a given city, right? So structural racism and discrimination through multiple institutions and structures in our society helps to explain why Black, brown, indigenous households are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the homeless population, right? But just having a larger Black or African American population doesn't mean you're going to have more homelessness. Okay, so it doesn't explain regional variation, but racism does help to explain who is more likely to experience homelessness within a city. So these individual attributes or characteristics don't explain regional variation, so we have to keep looking. So the next category of explanations we look at is local context. What is it that is going on in Seattle, San Francisco, LA, Boston, New York, DC, to explain why they have such high rates of homelessness? So my joke is that if I had a nickel for every time someone said that our moderate weather in Seattle was why we have homelessness, I wouldn't be a rich person, but I have lots more nickels than I do right now. So let me stress, weather doesn't cause homelessness. I want to be really clear about that. I think frequently people will go to Los Angeles and San Diego and say, well, of course they have homelessness. It's really nice here in January. I said, well, yeah, it is. It certainly is. But so is Miami, Dallas, Phoenix. And they don't have anywhere near the homeless population that LA does. And I've been to Boston in January, and Boston isn't real pleasant. And yet they have really, really high rates of homelessness in Boston. And so we selectively pick cities to fit our narrative. But when you actually plot them all on the page, what you'll see is there's zero relationship between weather and homelessness. There are cold places with high rates of homelessness and warm places with low rates of homelessness, and vice versa. Okay, so we can't blame Mother Nature for disproportionate rates of homelessness in our coastal cities. Another common explanation is that generous benefits are a magnet, that they draw people to a community to take advantage of these benefits. And this ultimately doesn't hold water either. for a couple of reasons. One is, I think it's grossly overstated how generous these benefits are. People call Seattle free-addle because of the, quote, generous benefits we have. If you ever tried to even come close to living on these benefits, you would find that they're woefully, woefully insufficient. But we also test this empirically to see, is there a relationship between welfare generosity and homelessness? And so what we use here is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program. If people say welfare, what they usually mean is TANF. This largely goes to women and children. And under the welfare reform under Bill Clinton in 1996, it gave states great authority and freedom to set the level of generosity. And so we have some states that are really stingy. We have some states that are very generous. And using that, we can kind of test, are more generous states magnets for homelessness? Is it a draw for people who are experiencing homelessness? And we adjust that welfare benefit by the cost of living just to compare states to states. And what you'll see here is that there's no relationship. There are stingy states, there are generous states, but they don't have any relationship to rates of homelessness. So this magnet argument doesn't really hold water when you look at it at a more macro national level. Another way to look at that is this migration story, which is, well, we still think there are people moving here from other places. And the first time I heard this explanation, I was in graduate school in Minneapolis, and everyone was blaming people from Chicago for the homeless population in Minneapolis. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And we studied it a little bit, and we couldn't find any evidence of that. And when I got to Seattle, the first thing I heard was, well, you know, everyone's moving here to experience homelessness. I said, oh, well, that's interesting. That's what they said in Minneapolis. And then I go to California, and they said, well, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness. And my favorite story in our book is the story of Middletown, Ohio. There was an article about them in the Washington Post, and they claim to be a magnet for homelessness because of their incredible generosity, right? And so by definition, everyone can't be a magnet. Yet I've never been in a community that doesn't believe that they're a magnet, right? Everyone believes like, well, you know, if we weren't so generous, we wouldn't have this problem. False, okay? There are low-income people moving to every jurisdiction in the nation, right? Poor people move, but they actually move at far lower rates than higher income people. But there's no positive relationship with rates of homelessness. In fact, the relationship is negative. There are more poor people moving to Philadelphia and Baltimore and Detroit than there are to San Francisco and Seattle, for example. Okay, so we can't blame the homeless problem in our coastal cities on disproportionate movement of low-income people into those jurisdictions. It just doesn't hold water empirically when you look at the data. And the last one is politics. You know, people will frequently say, well, you know, Boston, New York, DC, Seattle, San Francisco, LA are all Democratic cities, and therefore there must be a problem with Democratic policies. And so we actually plotted all of these metro areas in our sample over the time period that we covered 13 years. And we found that generally speaking, big cities in the United States are run by Democrats. And you may like that and you may not like that. That's probably a topic for another evening discussion. But the point is that Democrats run cities in the United States. San Diego and Miami briefly had Republican mayors, and then Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, was an independent. Otherwise, it's all Democrats. And so if you want to blame Democrats, that's certainly fine, but then we would also need to explain why Chicago and Cleveland, which are Democratic strongholds, don't have a problem with homelessness, right? And our argument is that we don't necessarily think it's those policies, that there's something else going on here. Sorry, I'm getting to the end of the day, and I lectured today, and so my voice is getting a little raspy. So the final category of explanations we pursue are housing market explanations. And this is where we start to actually see some real statistical power and explanatory power in this relationship. And this is median contract rent for each of the cities in our sample compared to rates of homelessness. And what you see is a positive upward sloping line with some statistical significance, right? Where rents are high, homelessness tends to be high. Right? And I joke that no one's going to give us the Nobel Prize for this slide, right? This has been understood for some time in the academic literature, but for whatever reason, this has really been a struggle to communicate this to a broader audience. A related measure is rental market vacancy rate. When vacancy rates are low, below 5%, which is kind of the neutral point of a healthy rental market, when vacancy rates are low, homelessness tends to be high. And again, R squared is much higher than we see from any of the other measures. And so if you were to tell me, not give me a city name, but just say, here are their rents and here are their vacancy rates, I could tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence whether they're going to have a problem with homelessness or not. And there are very few outliers here, right? The relationship is, it's not perfect. It's not going to explain all the variation, but it does a pretty darn good job of it. And so if you buy this argument, the question then would be, why do some places have high rents and low vacancies? Because that seems to be pretty darn important in explaining this phenomenon. And is it just because there are people moving to these coastal cities? That's certainly part of the story. You know, Seattle has had a tech boom, you know, that aside from San Francisco has not been matched in this country. Amazon and Microsoft have radically changed this community. And so people say, well, okay, well, it's Amazon's fault. And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe so. But what's interesting is when we plotted population change and homelessness, what we found was basically no relationship. And this is the most surprising graph in our book. I actually ran this 3 times because I thought I'd messed up the numbers. I was like, I must have done something wrong. So then I went back in, did it again. I was like, I guess this is right. So I still wasn't convinced. And so I actually went into the data and was looking at each of these dots, thinking about what cities are these? And I finally realized that there are a lot of fast growing cities, particularly in the Sun Belt, who have not had the same levels of homelessness as our coastal cities. Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, Arizona, et cetera, are growing just like Boston and Seattle, but aren't having the same problem. And so what I realized is when I did this is that this is really a demand for housing analysis. You know, population growth is the primary source of demand for housing. And when you only look at demand, you're forgetting about the other side of the equation, which is supply. And so when we think about the relationship between housing and homelessness, we need to understand both the demand for housing and the supply of housing. And when we talk about housing supply, and I know it's already 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, and the last thing you want is Greek letters on your screen right now, but there's a measure in economics that's really important, which is called elasticity. Okay, and elasticity measures how much suppliers change their quantity produced when a price changes. And so to explain this more simply, here's a pen that I've got on my desk right now. If the price of pens goes up 5 times tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? The people who make these pens are going to produce a whole bunch of pens because it's a huge profit opportunity, right? They'll go to 2 shifts or 3 shifts and they'll open more lines to produce pens, whatever you have to do. And so what we'd see is we'd see a huge increase in pen production very, very quickly. And so generally speaking, we'd say that pens have fairly high supply elasticity. When prices change, we'll produce a lot more. Housing is different. If housing goes up 5 times tonight in Charlottesville, what are you going to see tomorrow in terms of a supply response? Zippo, nothing, because you can't build a house in a day. You need to get land, you need to get permits, and you need to have a general contractor and supplies and labor and da 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 da. So generally speaking, housing won't be as elastic as a product like a pen would be. But we also know from urban economists is that the supply elasticity of housing differs from region to region and city to city. And the 2 primary drivers of supply elasticity for housing are regulatory environment. How easy is it to build? What's your zoning, your land use, the permitting process, et cetera, and topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build. So San Francisco is the most inelastic housing supply market in the nation. Why? Because you have mountains and water, it's beautiful, and you have the most strict regulatory environment in the United States. So when we plot, this is an attempt to put both supply and demand on the same graph. And so the x-axis here is change in population. So, sorry. What you'll see on the right side are cities that are growing pretty quickly. And on the left, those that are shrinking, the Rust Belt. And then the y-axis is housing supply elasticity. So numbers above 1 would suggest markets that are fairly elastic, meaning they build a lot of housing when prices go up. So that upper right bubble to me is the most interesting one, which is Sunbelt cities that have grown pretty rapidly, but they've built a lot of housing. And as a result, they've been able to maintain relatively high vacancy rates. The numbers in parentheses are vacancy rates. The lower right quadrant, that lower right bubble, is the perfect storm for housing prices. Rapid population growth and inelastic housing supply. A bunch of people move here, prices go up and you don't build enough housing. What happens? Vacancy rates go way down. You can see those numbers in parentheses below 4% and really, really high rents. And so this is basic economics and should have been entirely predictable given what was going on in terms of demographic changes in these cities and the lack of housing production. So to give a little local context here, this is based on the Charlottesville MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area, which would include presumably some of your suburban locations. And what you'll see is I've done 5-year snapshots here from 2011 to 2021. This is from US Census. You'll see you've had pretty significant rent growth from just over $1,000 to $1,350, which is a meaningful increase. But what you've had is a massive decrease in rental market vacancy rates. I was actually saying to Matthew before we got on the call, I don't know that I can't think of another city where I've seen such a dramatic drop in vacancy rates. Right, so in 2011, you would have looked a lot more like Detroit and Houston in terms of vacancy rates. And now you're looking a lot more like San Francisco or Seattle. That's a problem. And so the fact that you are seeing increases in homelessness, I got the slide deck from Matthew, is certainly unfortunate, but based on these numbers, doesn't surprise me, because this is very consistent with the story that we're seeing play out in other cities around the nation. And so what do we do about this? Generally speaking, our response to homelessness in the United States has been through what I would call operating investments, creating an emergency response system, a crisis response system, which is essential. It's life-saving, right? The shelter system and all the things associated with that. But we're fooling ourselves if we think that that is a means to end homelessness. It is a response to homelessness. And I believe that we have a moral and ethical obligation to respond in a compassionate way. So I'm not opposed to these investments. But again, we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's going to end it. We also need to intervene upstream, which is to ensure that we have more housing that's available to people who don't earn high incomes. And therefore that will need and require capital investments to construct housing or to provide subsidies to people such that they can afford market rate housing. And from a land use standpoint, we also need to think about where housing is difficult to construct or build. We need to change our regulation and land use to ensure that more housing can be built. Generally speaking, our cities need to become denser and they need far more housing units. And we need a public market, or I should say a public sector response to ensure that there's some subsidies to allow for lower income households to access quality housing. But this is hard to do, these responses. One, because we have a short versus long-term problem. In Seattle, we have a huge unsheltered homeless crisis. People are demanding that our city respond to this in the short term. And yet the best solutions to homelessness are long-term in nature in terms of constructing housing that is permanent. So how do we deal with the crisis at hand while also keeping our eye on the long-term ball? That's tough. There's a question of who should be building this housing, the public sector or the private sector? The answer is probably both. But if we think that private market development alone will end homelessness, I think we're fooling ourselves. If you work full-time at Starbucks in Seattle and earn $30,000 a year based on our $15 minimum wage, you are nowhere near being able to access any private market housing within many miles of the city center in Seattle. And then if we believe that there is a public role in the fight against homelessness, does that come from local jurisdictions or the federal government or states? The federal government has not been a great partner on this over the last 40 years, and therefore it's pushed these problems down to states, counties, and cities. And because housing is so expensive, that is a huge burden on local jurisdictions. And that's an ongoing debate and tension that we have in our policy conversations here. So I'm at near the end of my slides here, which is good because I don't know how long my voice is going to hold out here. So the reason for writing this book was I firmly believe that if we continue to diagnose homelessness as an individual problem, it will undermine our efforts to end it. It's easy for us to look at Joe on the street and blame Joe for making poor decisions because that allows us to go home and not recognize that we own this. When we think about this as a structural issue, that means that we all collectively as a community, as a nation, are responsible for this crisis, and therefore we all have a responsibility to contribute to it. And therefore we need to be thinking about structural responses to deal with a structural problem of homelessness. And that structural response might mean dealing with systemic racism. It might mean dealing with income inequality. It might mean having a more robust production of affordable housing. All of those are structural responses that are needed to deal with the structural problem of homelessness. And so there hasn't been a lot of good news in this presentation. And so I always like to end on a slight bright spot. When I'm out giving talks, people will say, well, Greg, that's fine. You got your fancy graphs. I buy your argument, but I'm not convinced that housing is going to fix this. How do you know that housing will actually end this? And I'll say, because we've done it. We've done it. My parents' generation, my parents are in their mid 70s. Many of the men in that generation came back from Vietnam, and we as a nation, in essence, kind of ignored them. And military veterans were disproportionately represented in the homeless population, lots of behavioral health disorders. Fast forward a generation, we had men and women go to Iraq and Afghanistan. And when they came back, the government at the federal level, leaders of both political parties said, we don't want to repeat the mistakes that we did with the Vietnam generation. We want to ensure that our combat veterans don't experience homelessness. And so what did we do? We had political will, and we put resources towards ensuring that they had housing, and when they needed services. And that provision of housing cut veteran homelessness by 50% in the United States over the last decade. A massive, massive success story. And how do we do it? We gave them housing. Housing works, housing ends homelessness. The question is, will we extend that political will and logic for a broader population of people in our communities and in the nation? Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Greg. We're going to turn to Q&A time. Anna's going to hop on. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. And, we're going to, we just had a little bit of an academic lecture. We are going to make this practical. Thank you, Greg. That is so helpful. That's such important information.
I'm going to go fill up my water bottle. I'll be right back.
Okay. Anna, I will throw this question to you. What are you seeing and hearing about what's going on in cities that are kind of Charlottesville size, like smaller cities? Is Charlottesville unique relative to maybe other smaller cities in Virginia, North Carolina, in terms of how much they've seen the rates of homelessness go up, or is that going on elsewhere too?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Matthew. I think a strong example of how uniquely hard the Charlottesville housing market is to compare us to Harrisonburg, which is a city of fairly similar population, but has a very, very different characteristics and very different history. And absolutely, homelessness exists in Harrisonburg, but certainly are not seeing the really significant increases in population of people experiencing homelessness that we are here. We are at the Haven, we are predicting that 2023 will not just be the year where we serve more people than ever, but we're probably looking at an increase of 20 to 25% of unique individuals that we serve. January, I haven't looked yet at our February data, which came to me this morning, but the month of January, we had over 2,000 unique accesses of service. So that's not 2,000 individuals, that's 2,000 times services were accessed at the Haven.
Interestingly, Harrisonburg approved a 1,400 home development last night, and I don't think Charlottesville has approved, certainly not in the city, and I don't think the county has approved, Albemarle County has approved anything like that in quite some time. What are some things, I mean, so just to kind of tie this into what Greg was saying, I mean, are the factors of not enough housing, not enough rental units, high rent? I mean, does that seem like what's going on here in Charlottesville, or what?
Yeah, there's two things in particular that I want to say to this. Over this summer, I'm quickly looking at the names of, I'm trying to see like who is here, like in the webinar, and I'm seeing some names that I recognize, and some of these individuals took part in the Charlottesville area's sequential intercept mapping project that happened this summer. And essentially it was a bunch of nonprofit staffers and city employees coming together to work on our city's sequential intercept model, which has to do with intersection, particularly of mental illness and the criminal justice system. But What was really interesting was the first exercise that the facilitators had people do was they asked everyone. So this was the Charlottesville sequential intercept model. So all of these people here are service providers, either nonprofit employees or city employees. Asked them, how many of you actually live in the city of Charlottesville or Albemarle County? And almost no one stood up because people who are providing services can't afford to live here. So if my team can't afford to live here, it should not be surprising that individuals with significant vulnerabilities are those who are experiencing homelessness. The other thing I want to say that I think confirms some of what Gregg said is we see over and over again individuals in our community who have a housing voucher. And so what this is, it is essentially like it is a guaranteed form of payment to a landlord. Like this person's rent is like you're not going to have to worry about it. Like it's covered. And every single month, we see individuals in Charlottesville lose their vouchers because if you cannot secure a lease within a certain period of time from the day that you get your voucher, and usually it's 90 days, sometimes you can get an extension, other programs it's a different time frame. You lose your voucher if you haven't gotten a lease. And so people have these vouchers, they can prove that they can pay their rent, but there aren't units for them to occupy. So we've taken that's I think a really good case study when you take away the inability to pay rent, because that's not an issue here, but yet there's still not a unit for that person to take occupancy of.
So Charlottesville is rewriting its zoning code right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very, it's a big deal. Charlottesville hasn't done a significant change to its zoning code since 1991. In 1991, we downzone a bunch of the city and made it harder to build. And now we're thinking about some different ways of approaching zoning. And I just was kind of curious from your vantage point, what would you like to see in the new zoning code?
In the new zoning code, I would like to see the ability to have increased density of housing, because housing is the solution to homelessness. I also think that while it's easy to point the finger at Charlottesville because they're the one that is right now like rewriting their zoning code, like when you look at Charlottesville and Albemarle County, like Charlottesville is like this little dot, right? Like within this huge county, 90% of this huge county can't be built in. So I think if we restrict our conversation to what does the city of Charlottesville needs to do, I think we're actually missing the bigger picture, which is that Albemarle County needs to come to the table even more strongly, because I think Charlottesville is so small that even if we could build, even if there was no limit on density, there's just not enough square miles within our city limits without looking at Albemarle County as well.
Yeah, it seems like city, county, and UVA. Those are the three big players, and the city is doing work. The county is starting to redo its comprehensive plan and its zoning code, and UVA started a lot of committees. So we'll I work for UVA, so I think I'm allowed to make fun of them. So Gregg, to kick it back to you, someone just was curious to know, you mentioned local and federal responses. Is there any state level things? And this would obviously be kind of Virginia specific, but are there state level things that come to mind in terms of policies and funding?
For sure. Certainly from a funding standpoint, our governor just came out with a proposal through a combination of state funds and debt financing to commit $4 billion for housing in the state of Washington. That hasn't happened before. And that was a kind of a clear recognition of the crisis that we have and the need for the state to engage. I think the other really interesting state level action that is going to be happening around the country is and I was at UCLA at a conference where we were talking about this in a California context, is so many local jurisdictions have been resistant to change their land use. And part of that is because the intense local political pressure on, I don't want my neighborhood to change, and the same things that you talked about, Matthew, at the beginning of this call. And so what we're seeing is state governments saying, taking a very paternalistic approach and saying, hey, children, meaning cities, you have had your opportunity to make changes and you've chosen not to, therefore we're now going to step in. And so we're starting to see a lot more states then basically stepping in and saying, either at a state level or in certain parts of the state, you have to change your zoning. And there are certain cities that are kicking and screaming, saying, you're taking this right away from us. And the states are saying, well, that's tough. And so I would say there's kind of a resource side of it, and then there's kind of a regulatory side. And I think what we're going to see is states, behaving a little more aggressively than they have in the past. Behind closed doors, I think what you're going to see is some of those local jurisdictions and mayors saying, go for it, state. I don't want to have to be the one to stand up and say I'm doing this. And if I can blame the state, it's a lot easier for me. And so there's actually a synergy there. Some of them are going to say, no, I don't want this, but others might say it's a heck of a lot easier if you do this at the state level than forcing me to alienate my single family homeowners. And so I think those are two things to look for, not only in Virginia, but around the nation.
Yeah, it seems like Virginia is at least somewhat open to some more funding. The governor proposed what he sort of described as a way to the housing issues, particularly in Northern Virginia, but then has sort of failed to provide any details on what that exactly is going to mean. So Virginia is, I think, a little ways away from any major state level changes. So here's a really interesting question. When looking at investments in homelessness services and homelessness, basically, how well do those work in the context of a really poor housing market? I guess that question could kind of be for both of you.
Well, coming from a very poor housing market, I will answer that, and then happy to hand it over to Anna. But the national debate about housing first right now is a perfect example of this. So housing first is an intervention that has been empirically demonstrated to be a very good resource for people, especially those experiencing chronic unsheltered homelessness who have behavioral health challenges. And the evidence base is pretty robust. But what's interesting is when we're now seeing kind of organized campaigns against housing first around the country, and people are saying, well, look, if it works so well, we wouldn't continue to have homelessness. And so people say to me, Greg, if housing first works so well, why is Seattle's problem continuing to get worse and worse? And I said, well, we actually use it, but generally speaking, you need a unit to put people in for housing first to work. And when you don't have units, it doesn't work. And so to scale housing first to the scale of the problem that we have, 12,500 people in King County, the math doesn't work. It's the same dynamic, and I was talking about with vouchers. Vouchers work so long as you have a unit. If there's not a unit, it's the greatest thing ever, but you can't implement it. The same is true for housing first. And so when you look at jurisdictions that have had great success with housing first, it's Houston, Texas, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What do they have in common? Darn near double-digit vacancy rates and relatively affordable rents. And that's not to minimize their success, because there are plenty of places that haven't done that. They did awesome work to take advantage of the asset that they have, which is a more accommodating housing market, and they got people into housing using housing first. And they cut homelessness dramatically in those places. Now, will that playbook work equally well in Seattle if we just imported that? No, it wouldn't, because our housing market is very different. Which is why I say to people, the shortage of housing not only produces more inflow into homelessness, it also makes responding to it a heck of a lot more difficult, because the interventions we know that work don't work if you don't have housing units available. So that would be my rant on housing market dynamics with getting people out of homelessness.
Anna, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, what I would like to add to that is we absolutely know that the housing first works. We know that for every single person experiencing homelessness that a community houses, shelter is not housing, that community saves anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 annually in community resources. And the ability to house people is predicated on having brick and mortar units for them to occupy. We also know that the vast majority of people with serious mental illness and substance use disorder who are either in active addiction or whose mental illness is in crisis, the vast majority of them do not experience homelessness. So there is something to say that if housing first must not work because people experiencing mental illness and substance abuse remain homeless, is just it's a logical fallacy. It's a lazy way to make communities feel better for either not doing enough or not being willing to do the hard things.
I work at UVA Hospital, and just from firsthand experience there, it's very hard to have successful physical health or mental health treatments when you don't have a consistent place to live. That I think is very obvious in some respects, but it's just the realities of if you have cancer and need follow-up for your treatments, if you're going to radiation 5 days a week for 6 weeks or chemotherapy, all these things. It's a lot easier when you have a home.
What national data shows when we look at things called social determinants of health, of which housing is the biggest one, when you look at individuals experiencing a mental illness, the strongest predictor of their health and well-being is not their access to clinical care. It's their ability to access stable housing. If I was looking at a person with serious mental illness who was not housed and I had a magic wand and I got to choose whether to give them access to the best clinical care for the rest of their life or to give them housing for the rest of their life, I would choose to give them housing because the data shows that that will have the most impact over their lifetime.
Wow. Yeah, here in Charlottesville, you have access to very quality medical care, like literally around the corner in some situations. And I'm going to ask you one last question. You had mentioned at the open house event last month that the Haven is seeking funding from City Council in the new budget. Is that? I believe if I'm wrong, you said the Haven has actually not previously received funding from the city, or the funding has been. Could you clarify that?
Yes, absolutely. The Haven's most publicly facing community service program is our day shelter, and our day shelter has never been funded by the city of Charlottesville. That is because shelter, as opposed to housing, because I cannot stress this enough, people who are sheltered are still people who are experiencing homelessness. Sheltered is not synonymous with housed. Shelter alone has never been a city priority eligible for funding. It used to be ABRT and now it's Vibrant Communities. So provision of shelter services alone has never been a priority for which we were eligible to apply for funding. So thankfully, the city has provided funding for our housing department, but our most public-facing service, which is our day shelter, has never been funded by the city. And so we, despite shelter not being a city priority, we asked for special permission to apply this year, and it was granted to us. So we have submitted a request for $100,000 for our day shelter. And if anyone listening would like to send an email to City Council and encourage them to fund that proposal, it is council@charlottesville.gov is the email address that will get you to all of them. We're about to transition to action steps, and the first action step I had was exactly what you just said. So we are on the same page.
it will take you all 1 minute to write a quick email to council@charlottesville.gov in support of $100,000 in funding for the Havens Day Shelter. You can do that.
You can. You absolutely can do that. And we also, our day shelter and shelter services in general are essential, because the reality of the situation is we can fix everything, but we can't fix dead. And if you're not sheltered, your ability to ever access a housing unit, should one miraculously become available in the city of Charlottesville or the county of Albemarle, it doesn't matter. And that's something that Gregg alluded to earlier. Like, we have a moral obligation to address the fact that in order to enact housing first with fidelity, we need to have housing units, and those are not going to come online overnight. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that we are robustly investing in shelter. But we cannot say that once we've done that, that we've checked the box and that we have solved homelessness in Charlottesville, because people who are sheltered are still people who are homeless.
Thank you very much to both of you. I have a couple things kind of wrapping up. So I want to announce our next webinar. I'm really excited about it. It's on the theme of housing, Wednesday, April 19th at 6:30 p.m. Brian Coleman, who's the second vice president of the Arlington branch of the NAACP, will be speaking on the relationship between missing middle, AKA in Charlottesville, medium intensity housing, and racial justice. The NAACP of Arlington recently sent a letter to their Board of Supervisors in Arlington after the Board of Supervisors trimmed back the missing middle proposal there, and said the board's removal of options for 8plexes will result in fewer attainable homes and unequal housing opportunities in the same neighborhoods from which people of color have long been historically excluded. That is the same conversation that's going on in Charlottesville right now. It happened last night at the Planning Commission Council work session. We want to hear, though, from someone a little outside of our area to help us as an area think better about these medium intensity homes and how it ties into our racial justice goals. And then there'll be more information about that coming up to sign up. Livable Cville, we talked about how there is a county involvement. I'm going to drop into the chat. The county is taking a lot of input on their comprehensive plan, and Livable Cville is going to be a host of an input event at the end of the month. There's an Eventbrite that I just put in. If you're a county resident or someone who's interested in county housing, they've said they want your input there. And then if you're really feeling fired up right now about getting more housing in our area, this very evening, the county is holding a hearing on the old Ivy development, which would include over 500 homes, including almost 80 designated affordable homes. There's significant opposition to this from the wealthy neighborhoods surrounding this site. It would be great for some pro-housing voices to log on to Zoom or run down to the county office building. They're going to be there for a while at this hearing. It'd be great for people to provide public comment in support of the rezoning that's proposed. With that, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Gregg and Anna. This was really valuable. We will have the recording for this up on our YouTube channel in a few days. Thank you all so much.